Bine v-am găsit! Abuzul sexual reprezintă una dintre cele mai intense traume. Iar dacă vorbim despre abuz sexual în copilărie, cred că vă puteți imagina cu câtă încărcătură emoțională negativă poate să vină un astfel de eveniment și ce impact puternic poate să aibă asupra vieții unei persoane care trece prin asta. O astfel de traumă depășește de multe ori abilitatea individului de a procesa ce îi se întâmplă și devine copleșitoare. Îl avem din nou alături de noi pe Dr. Ron Frey de la Facultatea de Psihologie și Consiliere, Universitatea Tehnică din Queensland, Australia, un specialist care are o vastă experiență practică în acest domeniu și care predă profesioniștilor din întreaga lume pe aceste tematici atât de sensibile, alături de care ne dorim să dezbatem subiectul cu scopul conștientizării lui. Hello again, Ron.
Hi.
So, as we talked last time when we had you in our show, we just want to, our main objective is to raise awareness regarding this sensitive topic again, sexual abuse. And we would like to define it and to talk a little bit about how can we, of course, at the end of our show, how can we deal with it and how can we talk about it without maybe feeling shame about it.
So would you like me to start with a definition,
Yes.
perhaps? Okay. So sexual abuse, I suppose it's a little like family violence in that sexual abuse can be defined in a variety of ways, and there are some debatable parameters as to what it might include and might not include, but it's primarily unwanted sexual contact, well, in fact, any sexual contact, wanted or unwanted, between an adult and a child, and generally between children if the contact is unwanted or if there's more than a 5-year difference or 3 years and the child's
So
younger.
we have this aspect of 5 or 3 years
Yes.
difference.
Yes. So to distinguish it, say, from two children who are, naturally curious and exploring or something like that, that's not sexual abuse. Parents may have strong views on that, but that's not sexual abuse. Whereas if you have a child who's coercing a child into a sexual exploration or something like that, that is. And it occurs actually more commonly than people realize.
Can you tell us some
Statistics.
statistics, yes.
Not in terms of children. I don't think that, I'm not sure those statistics are kept. Generally, though, in social terms, sexual abuse occurs commonly enough that the figure that we cite in Australia and in many Western countries is 1 in 4 girls are actually sexually abused before
1
the
in
age.
4 girls?
Yes. And the figure that's often given for boys is somewhere between 1 in 7 and 1 in 10. So it occurs actually a lot, and those statistics are quite staggering. When I first heard it, I didn't believe them. But I've heard them from enough directions and enough surveys, and even some really classic surveys, like the Kinsey surveys in the 40s, where they simply asked people about sexual behavior. They didn't understand sexual abuse. They just simply recorded that I think it was either 20% or 25% of the women said that. And there was no particular reason for, they weren't looking for sexual abuse. They didn't really even make any sense of it. They just said people's sexual lives start very early, was the conclusion they drew. But looking at it now, we realized that those women had been sexually abused. So, and this statistic comes up pretty much over and over and over again when victim surveys are done, these sorts of things. And because we don't talk about it, most victims tend to feel that they're the only people that this has ever happened to. But if every single person who'd been sexually abused suddenly, grasped their heart and fell over dead, we would not believe the epidemic that would occur. And I don't know if you saw the news this morning, but actress Sally Field has just revealed that she was sexually abused by her stepfather, who was also an actor. It's there, and it's in so many forms with so many women. But again, it's seen as shameful, and so therefore it's not discussed. But no doubt there will be women who are listening to this who've been sexually abused, and men. And one of the messages I really want to give them is you're not alone. This happens a lot, and it was not your fault, and you do not need to feel shame about it.
So you said it happens in so many forms.
Yes,
and you also
yes.
said unwanted sexual contact, and I think we have
Yes.
to talk a little bit about it
Yes.
because
Well, wanted, when it's an adult and a child, it's always unwanted by definition. It is distinguished from children doing normal sexual curiosity, so that's not sexual abuse. So with children, it would be unwanted. So, but in addition to that, the sexual contact can range from probably the most common form is actually fondling a child, sexually, touching their genitals, that sort of thing, getting the child to touch the adult's genitals. But penetration is not unheard of. It certainly occurs. Things that really make us feel very uncomfortable imagining that someone would even imagine doing this to a child. But and then there's things that are some people regard as sexual abuse and other people wouldn't. For example, showing pornography to a child or something like that. And those are kind of the outliers. When we talk about 1 in 4, we're not looking at that. We're looking at something that involves some kind of either actual sexual contact or displaying genitals to a child or something along those lines, which is also fairly common too.
how does a child react to this? Because I think it's like a freezing mode when
Yes.
this happens.
Well, children have varied reactions. There's no single reaction that children have. Some children, some adults claim, and one of the most famous people to do this is the wife of one of our former prime ministers, who was molested by a judge in her neighborhood as a child. And she wrote an article about 25 years ago saying it didn't bother her at all. So that's one angle. But I wouldn't abuse a child on the assumption it wouldn't have an impact on them, however. In other instances, it's shock. It is known to be a cause of post-traumatic stress disorder in children. If it continues for a long period of time, it can significantly shape the way they see themselves and the way they see their own sexuality. If it's never discussed in a family, children often conclude that they were bad and that somehow this was some kind of punishment. If a boy is abused by a man, he might conclude he's gay, which may be an unacceptable sexuality for him. A lot of boys conclude they should have fought off the attacker, regardless of how old they were. I remember recently having a client who was 4 when he was abused, actually believed he should have somehow been able to hold an adult male at bay, this sort of thing. So the impacts can be really, really wide-ranging. And this is the thing about family violence generally, is that it doesn't have a single impact. It's not that we can say, if you do this, this is going to happen. This could happen, but many, many other things could happen as well. Some people who are sexually abused go on to be sexual abusers. However, again, that is the minority. That is not most of them. If you are a woman and you have a partner who was sexually abused as a child, it does not mean that you have to lock your children away from their father. Most likely someone who was sexually abused as a child will, like anyone who's witnessed family violence, they will do everything they can in their lives to have a different kind of family, and that will be their resolve. But in instances where the family didn't intervene, where it was presented as an okay thing for parents to do to children or adults to do to children, the most common abuser is still the father. Next most would be probably the stepfather, and then you have uncles, grandfathers, and so forth.
This is something that I would like to talk a little bit, because we have in mind that the abuser is a stranger.
No, that's very rare. Unfortunately, the abuser is almost always someone the child knows. I mean, you have to. How do strangers access children?
I think
that's
many
really
parents
hard.
have in mind the fact that maybe they go in the park and someone will give them candy, and then the child will live with a stranger.
And I'm not saying those people don't exist. Those people actually do exist, but they're not the people, unfortunately, that you need to worry about. The people that are much more likely to abuse the child are people in the child's circle, family, friends, teachers. music teachers. Why music teachers, I don't know, but we have the number of music cases involving music teachers I've worked with at any rate is quite large. Sports coaches is another one. Basically people who have access to the child on a regular basis and who can form a trust of the child, those are the people who are likely to abuse a child.
Can we think about some signs that we can?
Yes. The first thing is any dramatic change of behavior of your child. So if you have a happy, outgoing child who suddenly becomes very quiet, something's wrong. Doesn't necessarily mean they've been sexually abused, but you need to find out what's wrong. Some children will act out sexually and will replay, particularly if they're younger children. So that's another possibility. That's something that you can look at. And obviously, if a child tells you, children make up stories about things that are within their purvey. So they might make up a story about having seen a giant Easter bunny or something like that. Generally, they don't make up stories about sexuality because it's not something they know anything about. So if a child tells you that they're being hurt by someone or that they don't like someone or something like that, you need to investigate that further. Generally, a child will say, I don't like him, he hurts me. And that is probably a good sign that there's sexual abuse going on.
And can we see some signs regarding the other persons in our family that can?
How to pick them up. In retrospect, we often can. No, sadly, it's often very difficult. I would say, there are some things. I would say if you have a family friend who's contriving to spend lots of time with your children, I would wonder about that. Doesn't necessarily mean they're bad people, but I would wonder about it. When you go into child protection, after a while, you tend to suspect everyone, and I know that that's not a healthy kind of attitude to have. But I'm trying to think of what some others would be. Certainly, people who are trying to be alone with your children. You would ask, well, why do you need to be alone with my children? If you have even a partner who sort of locks you out in a sense when they're with the children, then I would wonder about that. These sorts of things. As I said, it's not enough to know if they've been abused themselves. And the statistics are not entirely clear. Some surveys of people who have perpetrated offenses against children show a small percentage of them were abused themselves. In the cases that I've dealt with, every single one of them was abused themselves. So,
can we think about some characteristics of the abuser? Why an adult person will do this?
Yes, why would they do it?
Yes.
Yeah. I think, firstly, because they can. So it's an act of power. It's an act of sex, but it's an act of sex through power. So that's the first thing. So anyone who's more powerful, it's the same reason you'd ask, why would someone rape someone? It's because they can. And so that's probably the first thing. Then there are some more specific things, and in the instances that I've worked with, and this is not necessarily statistically supported, but the instances where I've worked with, they've almost always been abused themselves, and they were never allowed to come to grips with it in any sort of way. And in fact, often when they're arrested is the first time that they've even told anyone that they've been abused. And so they've dealt with it their whole lives, and it's just sort of formed what to them is kind of a normal...
A normality, yeah.
Yes, sexual relationship.
This is how life
Yes.
is.
So for example, a while ago I worked with a man who had abused 2 children he was babysitting, and he actually filmed it. And he told me that he couldn't watch the film. He tried to, but he couldn't. And I think the reason for that was when he was abusing the children, he saw himself as a child abusing the children. When he watched the film, he saw a grown man abusing children. And he actually said it revolted him when he watched it, which was a good thing. I'm glad it did. But generally, when I work with offenders, we find out why. But the reasons are quite individual to the person, unfortunately. I mean, it'd be lovely if we could have some sort of a system where we would know in advance. In Australia, I don't know if you do this here, but in Australia you have something called working with children checks, and people who have any sort of criminal history that might affect children, so people who have a history of assaults, sexual abuse, drug abuse, these sorts of things, are not given these cards, or if they have one, it's taken off them. And so they can't engage with children a second time. So you can be fairly sure that your coach and your teacher and me, anyone who's ever who works with children, your counselor, your whatever, have not ever been arrested before for abusing children.
Yes, we don't have.
Yeah, it's a good beginning. It doesn't solve the problem completely, but it really does help. And broadening those checks to people in the population is a good thing. We also need to provide services for people who feel like they are about to abuse a child. Right now, where would they go? I mean, even in Australia, where would they go? In Western Europe, in England, and I think Germany, there are actually, not pedophiles anonymous, but there are actually crisis lines where you can call and that sort of thing. And I think most countries should consider that as a preventative measure.
I would like to talk a little bit about the impact of sexual abuse on the long term. First of all, I think we can talk about PTSD, but what else can these children feel when they are adult?
Well, it's the same as the impact of any childhood trauma. So depression, anxiety, perhaps extreme anxiety. They might present with ADHD. There may be sexual acting out behaviors that concern people and friends in school and this kind of thing. It might affect the way they see their own sexuality. As they get older, they may very well come to see sex as unwanted, and which may in turn impact on relationships. The thing about all family violence, but sexual abuse in particular, is it destroys trust. So people's inability to trust, I mean, if you can't trust your parents, if your parents have betrayed you in some way, it is awfully hard to find trust for anyone. And including, this is a problem we have as counselors. We sit down next to people and say, I'm here with benign intent. But in fact, why would anyone believe that? And I have a colleague who always says when she goes out to meet a child in the waiting room, she says, I have to remember I'm the scariest thing that child's going to encounter today. And it's true. If we're thrown off a horse, we're shy around horses. If we're betrayed by people, we become very shy and reluctant to engage with people. So as we talked about family violence, sexual abuse, any form of child abuse, is the gift that keeps taking. And it does that across an entire lifespan. When you work with older males who've been sexually abused, for example, often it disrupted their education. So they are only able to work physically. They're not able to do a desk job. They've destroyed, or they haven't wanted relationships, so they've been very distant in their relationships. So they don't have family, and now they're coming into, say, their 50s or something like that, and they can no longer work. And we're finding that these men have nothing to live for. And we're even anticipating a spate of suicides amongst these men because they have no family, they have no friends, they've isolated themselves because of what's happened to them.
And maybe it's very difficult for these persons to confess to someone, even if it's close, a husband or parents. Or...
Yes. I mean, if you're a male, you are confessing, firstly, that you weren't able to fend off your attacker. Secondly, they targeted you. Was that because you were gay? Why could that have happened? And then thirdly, most men are afraid that to say I was a victim is tantamount to saying I'm a perpetrator. And that's the deepest fear that men have, and that's the one that men are reporting most nowadays. Men used to report fear of being gay, and I think still men feel that way. But because our attitudes toward sexuality have changed so much in recent years, that one is not a big fear. Now the fear is everybody will think I'm a perpetrator too. And women, on the other hand, who confess to having been abused as children, don't face that in the same way, and people don't automatically think that of women. So,
is there a moment when someone can confess? Because we were talking at our class the other day, and we find it in therapy. I don't know, in a session, maybe the sixth one, the seventh one, someone comes and just says it, and
yes.
we think that that's the moment when the person felt safe.
Yes, after developing trust. When I first started working with sexual abuse victims, which was 26 years ago, most of the people I worked with were in middle age. So they had raised their families, they had established their careers, these sorts of things, and then they found they had the space to deal with childhood and resolve childhood issues. Then there was a whole group of people who started talking about sexual abuse publicly. You might recall Roseanne Barr talked about it. We had a number of very prominent Australians at that time who came out and started talking about it. And suddenly I started getting clients who were in their 20s who were coming. But the average gap between when a woman is abused and a woman confesses is, I think, around 7 years. But for a man, it's 27.
27.
And that's in a culture where we are talking about it. So it's really difficult for people to come out and talk about it because they fear being overwhelmed by it. But they mainly, I think, fear what it's going to mean for their lives. And again, I would encourage people to who are listening to this to find a counselor that you can trust.
And it's like a stigma. It's like I did something wrong. It's like my life is going to change and I better never say it.
Well, if you can imagine, if you're being sexually abused, it's secret. There's a sense that it's kind of dirty. I mean, we often think that about sex anyway. It's, we use expressions like get down and get dirty, that kind of thing. So, and the child picks all that up. So to talk about it is actually raising those feelings again of feeling dirty, feeling contaminated in different ways, all of these things. They pick up the feelings from the environment that surrounded the abuse. And again, I would say to the listeners, you're not dirty. Give the problem back to the person who hurt you. This is not your problem. He was acting in a dirty way. He was being secretive and all of that. You weren't.
What I heard in therapy is that, I want to just tell you something. I know that you can't change things, and it's just like me. This is who I am. I was sexually abused, and I only want you to know that.
Yes.
And this comes with I know my hands are tied. I want you to know that, but I know that you can't do anything about it.
But it depends. There's a lot we can do. One is we can take it out of the emergency systems of the brain and turn it into your history. So it's what happened then. It's not happening now.
It's like creating a narrative about your life.
We create a narrative. So the first thing that we're doing is we're putting it in the past. It's the way you can really put it behind you is by talking about it. Ironically, most people think that that's not the way to do it, but that actually is. The other thing we can do is we can actually look at how it's played out in your life and given you, I mean, the very way the person's describing that is, I don't have choices. We can open those up. We can
There are many choices.
There are many choices, and we can help you access them effectively, and that's something that we can do. I've known very few people who have gone into therapy for childhood violence who did not, in the end, feel extremely grateful and really glad that they did. And liberated, yes. One of my clients once said it was like there was a huge weight that was sitting on him, and that like he was a spring that had been compressed. And he said it took that off and he could recover. So it gives you the chance to be much more the person you are and can be, to realize your possibilities, and to actually step away from, the lasting impact is someone has hurt you, and they have said, this is who you are, this is what you deserve. This is a chance of getting that person out of your life forever, and not being the person who was hurt. Yes.
So after they confess in the therapeutical process, do they confess in their family environment?
Sometimes, yeah. That's up to them, of course. I mean, the whole thing is, sexual abuse, and indeed all child abuse, takes away your right of decision. So in counseling, we give it back. You don't have to tell anyone. You don't have to tell me even. You can decide what you tell me. I have sat from time to time with my back to the client while they've talked. I've even left the client in the room alone sometimes to decide. I've let the client write me in a letter. I've let the client just say, this happened, but I want to talk about it. I want to talk about this instead. The important thing is that we as counselors do nothing to take away the freedom. You've already lost that happened once. We're giving it back now. And so if you want to tell your family, if you want to tell 3 members of your family, some people want to confront the abuser. We have people occasionally who take the abuser to court. Any of these things are options, but you shouldn't feel compelled to do any of them in particular.
Your hands are not tied.
Your hands are not, yeah, we want to untie your hands. That's exactly right.
Thank you very much, Ron.
It's been a pleasure.
Very pleasant meeting. Thank you.
Yes, likewise.
În procesul terapeutic apare frecvent acest subiect al abuzului sexual, de multe ori după ce relația terapeutică este una solidă, iar clientul se simte în siguranță să vorbească despre asta. Rănile produse de abuzul sexual sunt extrem de adânci și de cele mai multe ori persoana abuzată nu are abilitatea de a procesa ce i s-a întâmplat. Am abordat cu încredere acest subiect azi, tocmai pentru a putea să fim vocea persoanelor care trec prin această situație, cu scopul de a le arăta că există soluții și că în procesul de vindecare pot să primească suportul de care au nevoie. Iar mesajul pentru cei care nu au trecut și nu trec prin asta este să învețe să fie suport pentru cei care au nevoie de ei. Până la ediția viitoare vă doresc o săptămână cât mai ușoară. Numai bine!